jiftakar li konna spiċċajna l-ispjegazzjoni ta' Ardala. Tajtkom il-background tiegħu, formazzjoni tal-Gżejjer Maltin u l-esplorazzjoni tal-art ta' Ardala li beda minħabba l-fatt li jridu jfittxu bdalijiet tal-bniedem. Mbagħad aċċidentalment skoprew bdalijiet ta' fauna li tappartieni għall-epoka glaċjali u post-glaċjali wkoll. U kont ipprovat intikom ukoll dal-film żgħir qasir m'għandu 15 minuta illi tikkollegana ma' sqalija għaliex l-istess animali li sibna hawnhekk sabuhom sqalija wkoll. Però hija interessanti ħafna u forsi jenkom tifhmu aħjar il-proċess tal-naniżmu jew dwarfism ta' dawn l-animali għalfejn kienu u dawk iż-żgħar għaliex kibru. Bħal giant swan, pereżempju, li kellna. U kont fortunat ħafna li tibda dal-video u internet u naħseb jenkom ħafna wkoll tifhmu il-proċess tal-estinzjoni ta' dil-fauna mhux biss hawn Malta imma sqallija wkoll.
There's an old story of a Greek warrior's voyage home from the Trojan War, whose path led him and his men to the island of Sicily, where they would become trapped in the cave of a giant cannibalistic cyclops, which began eating the Greeks alive, one at a time. After passing out in a drunken stupor, the soldiers jabbed a sharpened log into the eye of the giant, blinding him. As the men fled to the safety of their vessel, the cyclops, named Polyphemus, called out to his father, Poseidon, to curse the Greek leader, Odysseus, and ensure that his voyage home would be one filled with horrors and plagued by loss. But another story unfolded here long before the Trojan War, before Greek stories of cyclopses, before Greeks. At first, the setting for this story might not seem so unusual. On any normal day, the smell of salty sea air blowing in from the impassable surrounding waters would have loomed heavily across the island. You'd see cranes wading through ponds, you'd see tall swans marching on in control of their territory, and you'd see giant tortoises grazing on grass. You'd hear the croaks of frogs, while the songs of some 50 bird species would chime in the heavy heat, and you'd be surprised to hear the trumpeting calls of wandering parades of elephants. You'd rarely notice that an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea is an odd place to see such creatures, because you'd be distracted by the fact that these plodding animals were no taller than your head, because these were the smallest elephants there ever were. And it was here, alongside the other residents of this hidden world, their island home of Sicily, over 500,000 years ago, that was the setting for one of evolution's most bizarre spells. The first hints from this vanished world were unearthed in a different time by another species living in a different world. It was 1859 when an English survey ship landed on the little island of Malta, just south of the Italian island of Sicily. Thomas Spratt wasn't just the captain of the vessel, he was also a skilled geologist, and it was while exploring the island's caves that he would find small elephantine bones. He brought the collection of fossils to Hugh Falconer, a brilliant Scottish naturalist who announced the existence of dwarf elephants to the world when he presented his study of their teeth a few years later. But after dying from complications of his heart and lungs, it was left to an equally brilliant British scientist, George Busk, to take over the collection of fossils. Busk went on to publish a more detailed study of the remains in 1867, where he confirmed that they were indeed the bones of small elephants, but among them were 3 distinct size classes. Each of them, he believed, were separate species of pygmy elephants. Smallest of all were a few minute molars, which formed the basis of his species, which he classified closely to the Asian elephant, while naming it after his fallen colleague, Elephas falconeri. As the years ticked away, not much was made of the miniature elephants of Malta. Some new finds trickled in, but even a century after they were first found, little was known about them, and nothing in the way of skulls had ever been seen. But that changed in 1958, when a young scientist in eastern Sicily with a fondness for caves returned from an underground chamber, carrying with him a set of bones that, when pieced together, formed a skull that was far older than the ancient Greek artifacts that archaeologist Bernoulli Greek was used to study, but still managed to correctly identify as belonging to a very small elephant. After hearing the news, paleontologists wasted no time planning an excavation. After all, at the time, all that was known of the pygmy race were a handful of bones and teeth. After 2 years of digging in the site, called the Spinnegallo Cave, they had collected 3,000 bones from 104 individual elephants. In 1962, exactly 100 years after Hugh Falconer first presented his work on the elephant teeth from Malta, they announced their find. Among the most prized specimens were several skulls, some of which were near perfectly intact, as seen in their paper. In all, 6 skeletons were assembled, 4 of which were put on display at the University of Rome. But pygmy elephants weren't the only thing found in Spinnegallo Cave. Not far from the bones of Elephas falconeri were extinct species that have also been found on nearby Malta, because 600,000 years ago, the 2 islands were attached by a strip of land, joining them as one. Giant dormice, twice the size of living ones, tiny teeth and bones from dwarf hippopotamuses, fragile pieces of an extinct sort of oversized swan. The existence of these oddly sized animals are directly the result of their isolated environment, particularly a principle called the island rule, which comes in 2 extremes. On one hand, it has the power to take large animals and reduce their size drastically, a phenomenon known as insular dwarfism. On the other side of the extreme, it's been known to cause insular gigantism, whereby usually small animals can balloon to a much greater mass. Traditionally, the reasoning behind it is simple. Compared to the mainland, islands tend to have a much more limited food supply, typically not enough to sustain hordes of multi-ton herbivores. So when groups of large animals end up trapped in an island environment, the evolutionary pressure to survive on less food intensifies. Given enough time in isolation, perhaps many thousands of generations, they adapt to the conditions, and their body mass slowly shrinks. And as in the case of the elephants buried in Spinnegallo Cave, the change can be severe, shrinking them to a mere 2% of their ancestors' original size. And in the case of the Spinnegallo elephants, their ancestors were huge. Early on, it was suggested that the pygmies evolved from some lily elephant species, but it was the giant Paleoloxodon that could be found roaming Europe and Asia 800,000 years ago. In the east, the 24-ton Goliath, Paleoloxodon novidicus reigned, but it was the European species, Paleoloxodon antiquus, or the straight-tusked elephant, from which the dwarves of Sicily and Malta would emerge. During the Earth's unstable climate, in a time called the Pleistocene epoch, when sea levels would ebb and flow as glaciers crept further and further south in a series of ice ages, you would find elephant numbers drifting south in search of warmer conditions, as land sprang up between the sea, closing the gap between the mainland and the island of Sicily. The intervening space would have shrunk to a swimmable distance. While most meat-eating mammals and big herbivores aren't so eager to swim any long distances, the rodents, hippopotamuses, and straight-tusked elephants of southern Europe would have had no trouble reaching Sicily by swimming a few miles or paddling across a marshy land bridge. But when the sea levels would eventually rise again, and when the shallow land bridges would sink beneath the waves, the continental immigrants became trapped, and the island rule went into full swing. More recent research, though, seems to show that the island rule isn't so much a rule as it is an occasional pattern, with many exceptions. The shrinking of the straight-tusked elephants probably had less to do with food supply and more to do with the fact that once on Sicily, they were living in a strange, unbalanced ecosystem, free of competition and predators, with no other large herbivores to compete with. Being the dominant browsers in the landscape was no longer an edge, and without any carnivores to worry about, their bulk wasn't required to defend themselves. And this lack of predators meant that the rodents of the island could step into the open. fully able to forage for food safely, eventually leading to the giant dormice, Lithia melitensis. While the fossil elephants of Spinigalo Cave are beautifully preserved, not a single one of the 104 individuals is known from a complete skeleton. Instead, the specimens in the row are composites made up of multiple individuals to create a finished display piece. So when a pair of Italian paleontologists published a new analysis on the species in 2015, covering their anatomy, growth, lifespan, and life appearance, it gave us our closest ever look into the lives of these animals. The most surprising thing they discovered is just how massive these tiny elephants were. An elephant calf born in the Serengeti today that stands 95 centimeters tall will weigh something like 120 kilograms, but a bull Paleoloxodon falconeri, just as tall, weighed a hefty 300 kilograms, curved tusks and all, giving it a body mass 240% greater than an elephant calf of the same height. Standing 80 centimeters above the ground, tuskless females weighed about half as much, while a newborn was so small it could have stared at a pigeon in the eye. Size wasn't the only thing different from their straight-tusked ancestors. Their 98% size reduction left them with more babyish proportions. They were stockier, more broad creatures with an elongated and wide torso, carried by shorter, stubby forelimbs, while the straight-tusked elephants they came from had thick, sturdy skulls. The pygmies' larger, more infantile skulls left a vast space inside their heads to fill. As a result, in the new paper, the authors explained that their brains were probably extremely large, their numbers on par with the brain mass of dolphins. They also put forward the idea that since staying warm would be difficult for such little animals, they had to conserve heat wherever possible. Perhaps they had evolved smaller ears, or even a shaggy coat of fur to stay warm. The Pleistocene of Sicily was probably the only time in history when the local birds were taller than the elephants. Cygnus falconeri were the biggest swans that ever lived. Their island environment prompted the species to grow to be more than 2 meters long. At that size, even its immense 3-meter wingspan probably wasn't enough to get it into the air. While the sky teemed with flocks of little birds, the great swans could be found mostly on the ground, amongst a variety of frogs, toads, and lizards, all of which still exist today, and a giant tortoise that is no longer, a miniature hippopotamus now long gone, and of course, the overgrown and ever-present dormice. Together, this combination of animals, both big and small, both extinct and modern, would have made for a most spectacular of little worlds, an evolutionary stage with a cast of characters, each just as weird and wonderful as the next. But all things must come to an end. Nobody is sure how or when the islanders vanished, but as we know well, planet Earth was an unpredictable place at the time, and all things, especially a fragile community of odd island-dwelling beasts, were vulnerable to extinction. But the end of the giant swans and pygmy elephants wasn't the end of Sicily's island worlds. Remember, George Busk described multiple species of mini elephants now buried in distant Maltese caves. Scientists now believe that over hundreds of thousands of years, there were no less than 3 separate waves of straight-tusked elephants that reached Sicily and shrank down to dwarf status. And while none were as small as those from Spinigalo Cave, the life of Archaeological falconeri was only a chapter in a long series of migrations and extinctions of the colonizers and the colonized. But Europe's straight-tusked elephants didn't just give rise to the dwarfs of Sicily and Malta. In fact, the Mediterranean islands are brimming with their fossils. From Cyprus and Crete to the Greek Cyclades and Dodecanese islands, the unmistakable traces of miniature elephants have been recovered. Each population representing entirely unique species, separate offshoots from their straight-tusked mainland forebears. But distinctive fossils found on the island of Crete prove that the island was once home to another race of elephants entirely. As early as 3.5 million years ago, long before the pygmy elephants of Sicily and Malta, at least some of the Mediterranean islands were once home to mini mammoths, the smallest of their kind. Over vast stretches of time, the Mediterranean was filled with perhaps hundreds of little worlds, each with their own mixture of immigrants and natives, all of them separate from the evolutionary sagas unfolding across the continents they were sandwiched between. According to the epic story by the Greek poet Homer, Odysseus' voyage home was filled with horrors and plagued by loss. But before the drunk Cyclops had fallen asleep, he asked Odysseus his name, to which he responded, "My name is Nobody." While most of the fanciful inhabitants of the Mediterranean had already succumbed to extinction before humans colonized the islands, to the last populations of dwarfed beasts, like the pygmy hippos, eking out a meager existence on the island of Cyprus, and invasive species arriving not by swimming or crossing a new land bridge, but by boat, would have seemed like nobodies. After all, they lived for many thousands of years without any predators, and had no reason to fear humans, and they, as well as the last of the island worlds, were snuffed out, unable to cope with the dogs and other foreign beasts that the invaders brought with them. Ultimately, the people who would come to inhabit these islands, as well as the mainland of Italy and Greece, would flourish into some of the most influential cultures in history. They would develop the most amazing of art and philosophy, and plant the seeds for modern thinking. And they would write epic stories of gods and great wars, of strange creatures and man-eating cyclopses. But through it all, they would never fully realize the true wonders of the places they inherited, the skeletal traces of which were buried all around them, hidden in the caves where their children played, or poking out of rocks in the quarries they dug to build their cities. Even when strange bones of animals unrecognizable to anything they were used to were inevitably found, they couldn't have known that they belonged to lost worlds populated by beings just as remarkable as the ones that grace their stories. But though these charming island inhabitants have faded long ago, their memory hasn't. We've started to unravel these enchanted worlds more fully than ever, revealing their true colors, both big and small. Almost as if even today, on some remote corner of Sicily or Malta, you could still hear the trumpeting calls of tiny elephants playing in the mud of their local waterhole, alongside the giant flightless swans vigilantly guarding their territory, while giant tortoises graze and the songs of some 50 bird species chime in the heavy heat. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon, and in a way, so were the remarkable island dwellers of the Mediterranean, because if it weren't for the impassable, watery borders surrounding this polluted patch of earth, they never would have been. But to those early settlers who had never seen an elephant before, it must have been so strange, stumbling upon large, vaguely human-like skulls hidden deep inside caves. But in hindsight, their interpretation made a lot of sense.
Okay. Għarret nista naqtaw il-sound biex.
Għanet fieħ.
Okay, mela. L-aħħar darba konna bdejna il-periodu preistoriku Malti. Konna waqafna fil-fażi ta' Tarxintu, li hija fażi li tiddistingwi ruħha mill-żmien tal-ħaġar, żmien Neolitiku, għal żminijiet fejn skoprew il-bronz fl-Ewropa u wieħed mill-popli li kienu fl-Italja waslu wkoll Malta, jgħidu li huma Alpine origin, waslu Malta wkoll, u bdew fażi ġdida billi utilizzaw iż-żona ta' Tarxin mhux iktar bħala post ta' kult imma bħala ċimiterju. Jekk il-Gżejjer kif jgħidu ħafna, kif kitbu ħafna arkeoloġi ġew abbandonati madwar 2500 sena qabel Kristu, allura in-natura ovvjament tieħu over u il-fdalijiet jista' jkollhom ukoll jaqgħu f'rovina minħabba it-temp, ovvjament il-ħaxix li jikber qalb il-ġebel u naħsbu li it-tempju ovvjament ir-rovini tiegħu ġew utilizzati appuntu minn dan il-poplu bħala ċimiterju minħabba l-fatt li sabu ħafna urni ċinerari fil-lokal. U hemm ħafna evidenza ta' nerien fuq il-ħitan illi jaħsbu li huwa riżultat ta' dan in-nar illi konsmaw l-isma tal-individwi li kienu jiġu mitfunin. Ma hu maħsub illi dan il-poplu differenti wasal Malta madwar 2000 sena qabel Kristu. Nfakkarkom dejjem dawn huma rounded figures qatt ma jkunu preċiżi. Jista' jkun hemm varjazzjoni ta' 100 sena l-hemm jew 100 sena l jew anke 200 sena l fuq jew l-isfel.
Kif il-ċivilizzazzjoni, il-ċiviltà qabel il-bronz, kif sparixxiet? Hemm għandhom idea ċara?
Ma nafux eżattament, hemm ipotezi illi jista' jkun jew eżawrew ir-riżorsi naturali.
Dik 2000 sena
Roughly 2500 kienet mitmuma ġifieri il-Neolithic phase ta' Malta, ġifieri il-poplu oriġinali ta' Temple Builders mhux ġie stint, probabbilment abbanduna Gżejjer minħabba l-fatt li forsi kienu eżawrew ir-riżorsi naturali. Inti kon eżempju li ġara fi Easter Island fil-Paċifiku fejn l-indiġeni hemmhekk wara li qataw is-siġar kollha emigraw mill-gżira. Easter Island hija dik il-gżira fejn dak l-istatwi kbar bil-kappell fuqhom. U marru band oħra. Jekk Malta ġar l-istess ħaġa, hija ovvja li jippreferu jmorru f'artijiet iktar għamiela u fejn għandhom iktar possibilità ta' illi progredixxu. Nfakkarkom ukoll li l-Gżejjer Maltin dak iż-żmien jaħsbu li ma setawx jkun self-sufficient tal-aktar minn 12 maximum 15,000 people. Roughly. Jista' jkun anke inqas minn daqshekk. Ġifieri anke riżorsi naturali agrikoli wkoll jekk inti tuża kontinwament l-istess art il-prodott ma jkunx iktar ta' kwalità.
Ma taħsibx li kienu l-pirati l-furbana li ġew għadhom.
Kienu ħallu probabbilment traċċi tal-kultura tagħhom għax kienu jieħdu posthom forsi. Ma nafux għax il-kotba li rajt anke fuq Sqallija, il-perjodu Neolitiku fuq Sqallija ma jsemmux atti ta' piraterija fuq Sqallija nifisha pereżempju. Jista' jkun hemm każijiet iżolati, però dan huwa perjodu preistoriku fejn ma kienx jeżisti ebda forma ta' kitba. M'għandniex written record li nistgħu biss nipotizzaw. Imma dak li huwa fdalijiet ma sibna xejn. Ħlief linja preċiża differenti ta' dawk it-temple builders u l-kultura li introduċew fi żmien bronz. Ċeramika differenti, odot tal-metall, bronz ġifieri, u nuqqas ta' ħila wkoll arkitettonika għax ma ħallew ebda bini spettakolari li għandna ta' żmien huma sempliċi dolmens li huma xi ħaġa ordinarja ħafna issibhom fl-Ewropa kollha, issibhom Spanja u se naraw ħafna eżempji minnhom. Spanja, l-Ingilterra, Franza, Belġju, Ġermanja, kullum kien. L-unika ħaġa li tiddistingwi dolmen lokali minn dawk li hemm barra jista' jkun is-sajż tiegħu.
Meta dak dolmen fejn l-arka tal-ġebla.
Ftit ġebel u mbagħad jew capstone waħda jew ħafna ħdej xulxin. Però strutturi ġifieri huma modesti ħafna ħdej komparati ma' imma Stonehenge mhux dolmen, Stonehenge huwa u laqas huwa tempju, Stonehenge huwa osservatorju. U dak huwa 2800 huwa Bronze Age. Fil-fatt dik hija l-unika struttura sostanzjali ta' żmien il-bronz illi nafu biha ta' dak id-dimensjonijiet enormi. Hija l-komplement tal-Ewropa setgħu eżistew strutturi simili, però b'dalit tagħhom ma fadalx bħala ġebel sostanzjali ta' forum biex ngħidlek sodisfaċenti biżżejjed biex narfu l-forma oriġinali. Ma ninsewx li kienu żminijiet fejn ħafna popli kellhom idraw li kannibalizzaw il-ġebel li jsibu lest. Flok jiftu barriera, jkissib il-ġebel jiktab u aktar ekonomiku l-tqatta minna milli toqgħod tħaffer u anki il-fattur il-trizz. Mhux kulħadd huwa kapaċi li jagħmel dak ix-xogħol li fejn tista' tqabbad il xi ħadd u aktar faċli jutilizza dak il-materjal li jsib fil-viċinanzi. Fil-każ ta' Malta ma kellix problema x'Malta il-blat isibu kullum kien. Imma postijiet oħrajn ġieli kienu jġibu l-ġebel minn ħafna kilometri l-bogħod minn lok fejn jeżisti dak it-tip ta' blat. Mela, fil-każ ta' Tarxin għandna dan l-intervent ta' kitan ta' kulur ħamrani, skur, jew kannella li huwa riżultat ta' dawn in-nirien li ħakmu l-intern. U dana ħafna huwa attribwit minħabba l-fatt ħafna archeologi jattribwew għal-fatt li ippratikaw il-kremazzjoni fl-intern ta' dan il-lokal abbandonat. L-allat għandna statwetti żgħar tal-bronz ukoll ġifieri, il-forma ta' disk huma differenti, però ta' disk. Il-wiċċ huwa forma ta' ċirku kbir, sproporzjonat mal-ġisem, però speċjalment is-sider huwa identifikabbli għal dak ta' mara. Il-Mużew Archaeological hemm xi tlieta erba' minnhom daw il-disk gods.
Fil-fatt lejli, dik xi tiġi qabel
dik ta' żmien il-Neolitiku. Però tista' tidentifika l-istess alla taħt interpretazzjoni differenti. Jiġifieri m'hemmx għalfejn wieħed jikkopi l-istess forma, il-valur tal-oġġett u s-simbolizmu tiegħu. Issa mbagħad il-forma jekk bla ras jew eċetera, importanti li tara fis-sess tagħha biex tidentifika l-kux ta' sess maskili u femminili. Però fil-Bronze Age għandna wkoll rappreżentanza tal-forma femminili li naħsbu li hija l-kontroparti tal-mara l-koxna li sibna ta' żmien it-templi. Mela, il-fatt li waslu l-konklużjoni illi kien hemm kultura differenti f'dawn l-inħawi u anki postijiet oħrajn, hija minħabba l-fatt li sabu lejer sterili. Ġifieri, dan ifisser illi wara li ġew abbandonati t-templi ma kienx hemm interventi ta' nies li setgħu daħlu u ħallew xi ħiel tal-preżenza tagħhom. U dal-lejer ta' ħamrija u ġebel probabbilment huwa ta' oriġini ta' spostament ta' l-ilma li ġor ħafna bħalma naraw aħna meta jkun hemm inundation l-imsida, jinżel ħafna taqajn, ġebel u debri ngħidulu. Illi nġabar mingħajr ma sabu ebda evidenza ta' fuħħar, pereżempju, jew għadam ta' annimali jew ta' nies, ebda traċċa assoluti, għalhekk jgħidulu sterile layer, m'hemmx ebda ħiel ta' preżenza umana. U dan seta' nġabar biss undisturbed throughout the period of time, għax mhux layer li għax li ftit inqas minn metru. Mbagħad fuqu sabu il-fdalijiet ta' dan il-poplu differenti illi ġi mill-Italja li huma appuntu dawn l-urni krematori u odot tal-bronz u anki tipoloġija ta' foħħar ta' stil differenti. Mela, sa naraw Borċ in-Nadur. Borċ in-Nadur huwa nniżel bħala Bronze Age. Però Borċ in-Nadur hemm żewġ siti distinti minn xulxin. Hemm dawk li huma fortifikazzjonijiet u hemm tempju iktar l-isfel minnu li ħafna jfixkluh mal-Bronze Age. Fil-fatt mhux tal-Bronze Age xejn, għalhekk hemm salib fuqu. Dan is-sit ġie żviluppat tard ħafna fi żmien Neolitiku, l-aħħar fażi, ma tantx fadal pjanta sostanzjali tiegħu għax hemm ħafna disturbances u anki jista' jkun biżminijiet l-abbandun totali waqa' l-bini. Però il-forma ta' tempju jingħaraf minħabba l-fatt li dejjem utilizzaw l-istess blueprint, jiġifieri kuritur ċentrali u kmamar semiċirkolari fuq il-ġnub, illi nsibu wkoll Borċ in-Nadur. Hawnhekk hawn partita angoli tal-istess sit. L-erożjoni hija kif qegħdin taraw hija ħafna avanzata, il-ġebel mikul, forsi minħabba l-fatt li wara l-abbandun tiegħu kien viċin tal-baħar u kif nafu l-arja sal-Mastra għandha effett partikolari fuq il-ġebel Maltija. Naraw ukoll fuq il-ħitan ta' ħaġar fuq il-ġemp li ħares lejn il-punent. Dawn huma kollha fdalijiet tat-tempju li mniżżel bħala Borċ in-Nadur. Hemmhekk hemm isu dolmen fuq il-xellug. Jista' jkun u jista' ma jkunx, jista' jkun waħda mill-ġebel li waqgħet la ġenba u straħet fuq ortostat li hija dik il-blokka vertikali. Jew jista' jkun dolmen. Ħafna mill-iskavi saru fi żmien fejn ma kienx hemm studju xjentifiku bħalma insibu llum. Fis-seklu 20 kienu jagħmlu studju stratigrafiku ta' kull ler li jsibu. Imma ħafna mit-templi ġew klerjati fis-17 seklu fejn kienu jagħmlu kollox il-barra biex jesponu il-monument u jiġbru dak li jsibu waqt l-iskavi. Però ma kienux jistudjaw l-les kif kienu ġabru fuq xulxin u allura tlifna ħafna mill-evidenza illi hija importanti ħafna biex nifhmu il-progress jew anki l-fdalijiet li jinġabru fi żminijiet differenti. Dan ukoll jaħsbu li huwa dolmen fl-istess sit, però dejjem qegħdin naraw ġebel semmaj riċiklat li kien huwa dolmen mill-tempju li ġie abbandonat dak li aħna nsejħulhom it-temple builders, il-kultura neolitika li bnew it-templi jew Malta. Mela, il-propja Bronze Age site huwa iktar il-fuq minn it-tempju ta' Borċinadur. Dan huwa ġenb wieħed mill-ġnub tiegħu, dik il-ħodba li din naraw huwa il-materjal li ġie skavat minn Margaret Murray fil-1920s u resqu l-materjal kollu fuq ġemplijiet, jiġifieri dak mhux ma kienx hemm kien spustjat il-ħitan biex kixfu l-ħitan resquh kollu law.
Ngħidu Bronze Age għax dew jużaw il-bronz.
Għax il-poplu li bniet dik jiswu bħala opera difensiva. Huwa ta' żmien Bronze Age, ġifieri qegħdin nitkellmu aħna minn 2000 BC l-isfel.
Ma dew jużaw il-ħadid, għalhekk għandna Bronze Age.
Kien poplu li kien ara fl-użu tal-bronz. Mhux għax kien hawn bronz hawn Malta, kien importaw, ovvjament, imma it was a Bronze Age culture. Il-Neolitiku huwa definit propri minħabba l-fatt li kienu popli fl-Ewropa kollha, ġifieri il-Neolithic cultures tal-Ewropa kienu jutilizzaw ġebel, ma kienux jutilizzaw il-metall. Għalhekk jgħidulu Stone Age. U Neolitiku huwa l-aħħar fażi. Għax hemm il-Paleolithic, Mesolithic u Neolithic. Neolithic fil-każ ta' Malta jibda madwar nofs is-seklu, nofs il-millennium, 6th millennium, roughly 5200 skont il-datazzjoni ta' Ardalan, fejn sabu l-ewwel fdalijiet tal-bniedem Malta. Però kif għattilkom lezzjoni ta' qabel, illum qegħdin jaħsbu li l-bniedem wasal Malta ferm iktar qabel fil-żmien Mesolitiku u resqu d-data tal-ewwel kolonizzaturi madwar 600 sena qabel il-fażi ta' Ardalan. Dan huwa il-propja Bronze Age remains tas-sit fejn naraw struttura ferm differenti minn dawk il-builders templi tradizzjonali li nafu bihom. Donhom ġabru ġebel alla rieda u mbagħad għamlu packing ta' ġebel li hu iżgħar biex jimlew l-ispazji mod unit kif qegħdin naraw. Il-għala waslu l-konklużjoni li din hija opera difensiva ma nistax ngħidilkom ma nafx qatt ma qrajt għaliex. Isemmuh biss bħala a defensive wall. Jekk verament kien ħajt difensiv, ma nafx fuq liema kriterju waslu din il-konklużjoni. Jista' jkun jista' ma jkunx.
Defensiv kontra xi għadu, mela bil-fors.
Nimmaġna, imma ġifieri x'indika li huwa għax qegħdin naraw ħajt biss, ħaġa li nissospetta ħafna li hija moderna hija l-ħajt intern tiegħu. Il-ħajt intern tiegħu huwa intatt. Huwa ta' forma ta' ġebel ta' size modern, forsi medjevali, ngħidlek. Jista' jkun li l-sit antik ġi riċiklat u utilizzat għal skopijiet iktar tard. Però huwa dettall ta' suspett kbir jekk il-ħajt intern huwa tal-istess żmien tal-ħajt estern. Għax it-teknoloġija kompletament differenti. Taraw kompletament differenti. U nsibu ħafna ħitan ta' sejt fil-kampanja tal-tip ta' format. Għalkemm ħafna mill-affarijiet huma miktubin minn archaeology użaw daqsxejn il-loġika u you have to analyze if whatever you read is credible or simply l-risposta azzardata biex imlew il-vojt. Do not be afraid to question what you read. Ġifieri, użaw il-loġika tagħkom biex issibu spjegazzjonijiet iktar plawsibbli. ċertu affarijiet li ma jistgħux jingħataw spjegazzjoni jridu jibqgħu misteru, ma nistax niffittjaw risposti għal kollox. Għaddew sekli kbar minn dak iż-żmien u dak li forsi huwa ovvju għalina illum il-ġurnata, forsi dak iż-żmien kien hemm raġuni differenti għala utilizzaw sit għal ċertu skop differenti minn dawk li naħsbu llum.
Ma setawx jużaw x'tip ta' dating, carbon dating bil-ħadd.
Mhux minn hawnhekk imma.
Ma tistax.
Le, għax Mari fi żmien Mari ċalqu kollox ma kienx hemm radiocarbon dating bħal hemm illum. Dak kien possibbli pereżempju mill-skavi ta' tramplaw. Għax skorba pereżempju huwa tagħna l-opportunità perfetta biex neżaminaw dak il-materjal organiku illi ġie skopert f'dak is-sit. U fil-fatt minħabba l-iskoperta ta' Trump, il-kronoloġija neolitika ta' Evans ġiet mibdula kompletament. Ġgantija qabel Trump skont Evans kien ta' 3000 BC, per eżempju. Ma kienx bħalma għallum 3600, imma l-inserzjoni l-iskoperta ta' Trump għalkemm żammit kien diġà jaf dak is-sit, imma ma kienx studjat b'mod xjentifiku. Trump għamel skavi xjentifiċi għax għamel eżami stratigrafiku u ħafna mill-materjal organiku iktar tard ġie eżaminat taħt il-lenti biex ngħidlek through radiocarbon dating u sabu li huwa ferm iktar antik u dak ċaqla il-sekwenza kollha tal-istess siti ta' skorba bħal ġgantija illi telgħu iktar il fuq fl-antikità. Mela, siti bħal Baħrija nafu li ħafna siti ta' żmien Bronze Age. Baħrija hija waħda minnhom. Hemmhekk sibna tip ta' fuħħar differenti minn inħawi oħrajn. Borċinadura sit ieħor tal-rajna l-ibdalijiet hemmhekk tal-ħitan fejn hemm tipoloġija ta' Bronze Age differenti ta' Baħrija, dak hemm Baħrija Base biex jiddistingwuha minn dik tas-sit ieħor. Il-Karraba wkoll sabu fuħħar ta' żmien Bronze Age qegħdin tinnotaw li dal-poplu donnu kien jippreferi jgħix fuq għoljiet li huma faċli biex jiġu għandhom difiża faċli naturali biex ngħidlek għax dejjem ikkuċċata din nitkellmu anke għawdex ċertu latos sabu ħafna fdalijiet ta' żmien bronz. U fl-Ewropa wkoll, fil-Spanja partikolarment ħafna mill-villaġġi kienu jkunu fuq għolja imdawra b'iswar naturali ta' blat. Għalhekk anke hawn Malta sibna tools jew armi tal-bronz u anki l-żniet forma ta' gleġġa sabu ħafna minnhom baħrija u jiġu deskriti bħala a warlike culture. Apparentement kienu segregati minn xulxin u kienu jiddefendu t-territorji tagħhom bil-forza biex ngħidlek. U l-fatt li instabu propju b'dalijiet tagħhom iktar komunement fuq dawn l-għoljiet ifisser li kienu siti privileġġjati għalihom. Al kontrarju tal-popli neolitiċi li kienu iktar paċifiċi.
Fl-għolja xkunu difiża.
Għax oġġett bħal dak m'għandekx bżonn tibnieh dan, għandek il-blat innifsu li speċi hija difiża naturali. Mela, tkellimna fuq iż-żewġ popli li jiddefinixxu iż-żmien preistoriku. Jiġifieri qegħdin nippreċedu iż-żminijiet klassiċi. Tkellimna fil-fond fuq Tarxin li huwa tempju iktar kompless mill-oħrajn kollha u huwa rappreżentattiv ukoll sa ċertu punt tat-tempji ta' Ġarqim, Imnajdra u Ċkantija kemm kollha għandhom ċertu dettalji individwali apparti, imma bażikament il-Tarxin jippreżenta daqsxejn il-fażijiet kollha. Però issa sa ngħaddu għal kwalunkwe aspett ta' arkitettura neolitika differenti mit-templi, għaliex it-templi ma kienux l-unika struttura archeoloġika ta' żmien preistoriku. Hemm ħafna forum ta' monumenti differenti. U fosthom insibu cromlechs. Cromlechs huma xriki, xara Brockdorf Circle hija waħda minnhom. U nsibuhom ħafna fl-Ewropa wkoll. Malta għandna tnejn li huma ferm iżgħar u ħafna drabi fl-Ewropa sabuhom fuq siti fejn jinstabu ħafna fdalijiet umani. Probabbilment kienu ċimiteri. Il-fatt li jinstabu fuq siti ta' sepolturi indika li jista' jkun il-ċirku kellu xi spjegazzjoni partikolari li tikkolleghom ma' xi rit funebri jew xi kult tal-mejtin, ma nafux eżattament, ma xi wħud jazzardaw jgħidu li jista' jkun li ċ-ċirku għandha tifsira partikolari għal dawn il-popli illi għadna ma wasalniex nikkonkludu eżattament x'simbolizmu għandhom. Il-fatt li nstab madwar il-hypogeum, għax dak huwa hypogeum bħal saflini. Hypogeum Greek tfisser underground. Jista' jkun li anki għal saflini kellu ċirku madwaru, però minħabba l-iżvilupp taż-żona anki fi żminijiet moderni tal-kavallieri it-traċċi ta' ċirku fuq il-sit tal-Saklini li sparixxew żminiet ħafna il-bot mill-lum ma nistgħux naċċertaw jekk kienx hemm xi ċirku fuqu, sfortunatament. Però siti oħrajn fl-Ewropa għandhom din konsistenza li ħafna drabi f'nofsu jsibu ħafna oqbra jew kannieri fejn kienu jiddepożitaw l-għada. Illum fil-fatt qegħdin naraw dan huwa bbażat fuq l-ism ta' Brockdorf. Però llum jekk wieħed imur fuq is-sit tax-xara Circle għawdex kull ma jsib minn dak ċirku xi 4-5 ġebliet biss, komplement kollha sparixxew. Jew permezz tal-iżvilupp edilizzju li kien hemm fiż-żona illum m'għadhomx jeżistu dak ġebel, ġifieri qegħdin ngħidu żmien reċenti jekk Brockdorf għamel dak ċirku fil-water palace tiegħu jfisser li fi żmien dan kien għadu hemm. Però llum jekk wieħed imur fuq is-sit kull ma jara xi 4-5 ġebliet m'hemmx iktar minnhom ma fadal xejn. Hawnhekk qegħdin taraw is-sit ta' taħt l-art fejn sabu ħafna għada li ovvjament jiddetermina l-fatt li kien ukoll sit fejn kienu jiddepożitaw il-mejtin, il-ċimiterju f'lim ieħor mhuwiex sofistikat għal Saklini hawnhekk utilizzaw parti tajrin li kienu preeżistenti u żiedu magħhom ukoll. Xi wħud minnhom kabbruhom ukoll.
Kremazzjoni kienet spiċċat.
Le, kremazzjoni baqgħet sejra anzi fi żmien klassiċi. Kien hemm żewġ tipi ta' tfin. Jew kremazzjoni, jew nkella diskarnazzjoni fejn kienu jisponu l-ġisem anke fil-Palestina kienu għamluha ġifieri. U mbagħad meta l-laħam jitmermer jiġbru l-għada jidefsuhom taħt l-art. Fl-Anatolja ħafna mill-oqbra li sabu pereżempju kienu ġodjar. Kienu il-familja kienet tippreferi kollha l-għada tal-antenati tagħhom ġo darhom stess, jew taħt is-sodda jew xi kantuniera. Jekk kien hemm il-prattika ta' diskarnazzjoni, forsi din il-prattika kienet isir għall-apert, ovvjament, ġewwa ċirku. Mbagħad jiġbru l-għada u jpoġġuhom taħt l-art.
Il-Persjani fil-fatt għadha Zoroastrians jużaw l-istess għalhom flori għalli għal-vultures kienu
eżattament. U għalhekk ħafna drabi fl-oqbra insibu l-għada nisbuha l-aħmar, ma setawx jisbuha bl-aħmar bil-laħam fuqhom, bil-fors kienu jippratikaw id-diskarnazzjoni l-ewwel, u mbagħad jisbuhom l-aħmar għax qedna l-aħmar huwa simbolu ta' ħajja, id-dem. Jekk vittma teħdilha d-dem, ovvjament tmut. Id-dem kienu wkoll il-kulur ħamran kienu wkoll simbolizmu ta' ħajja. Anki fil-kult tagħna nisrani meta l-qassis jilbes paramenti ħomor ifisser qed tiċċelebra jew il-passjoni ta' Kristu jew il-ċelebrazzjoni ta' festa ta' martirju ta' xi qaddis.
Stati fuq 5 minuti bħala vertos.
Iva.